We are so excited to have Ted Reinstein here again at the Wayland Library. Welcome, Ted. Thanks everyone for signing on to a Zoom presentation of Ted's book, Beyond Brooklyn, the Unsung Heroes Who Helped Break Baseball's Color Barrier. As many of us know, Ted has been a reporter for Chronicle on WCVB Channel 5 since 1997. It's America's longest running locally produced nightly news magazine. He's also a contributor for the station's Political Roundtable and sits on the editorial board. He has another book, which I think we heard about. You visited and talked to us about New England General Stores most recently, but Ted also wrote a New England Notebook, One Reporter, Six States and Uncommon Stories, and Wicked Pissed, New England's Most Famous Feuds. So I'm going to get out of the way, get off the screen, and hand it over to Ted. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Courtney. And we'll invite Courtney back for our Q&A. And as Courtney said, I'm going to talk to you just under the next hour about my newest book, Before Brooklyn. And this is a story that in many ways I wanted to work on because it really goes to how we understand history in terms of sometimes thinking we know something and yet not fully appreciating some of the details and some of the wider context that is there. And this is a perfect case in point. So I like to start with actually posing a question, which if we were in person, I would be able to take hands. But in this case, I'm going to pose the question and then I'm going to give you the answer. So the question is, after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, who became the second Black Major League Baseball player? And when I put that question to audiences, I get great guesses. I really do. People like Larry Doby and Monty Irvin and Sam Jethro and folks like that. But they're all wrong because it's a bit of a trick question. Because after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, the second Black Major League ball player was Jackie Robinson. Because Jackie Robinson did not do the thing that a vast majority of people think he did. He did not integrate Major League Baseball. Surprise. He reintegrated Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball had been integrated 60 years before Jackie Robinson by this man, who also is almost entirely unknown to Americans today, Moses Fleetwood Walker. So that tells us already, right, that we don't fully appreciate the history of Jackie Robinson's own achievement, and we don't fully appreciate the fact that the environment in which he did it, Major League Baseball, had also been integrated and had been an outlier, really, 60 years earlier. Because when Major League Baseball is born and begins to grow in the 1870s and 1880s, it actually looks a little bit more like America. There are Black players on otherwise completely all-white teams, people like Bud Fowler. Bud Fowler, one of the most exciting and passionate, extraordinary players in early baseball. He was somebody who lived to play baseball, as we're going to see, and his story goes from extraordinary to heartbreaking. As you'll see, Frank Grant, the first Black professional ball player from Massachusetts, the Berkshires, and most famous of all, the Walker brothers. Moses Fleetwood sitting right here. I'll move my cursor right here in the front row. And he was briefly teammates with his younger brother, Weldy, right here on the 1881 Oberlin, Ohio college baseball team. And so this tells you something about how the Black experience in professional Major League Baseball was different than we sometimes understand it. Moses Fleetwood Walker, who most people have never even heard of today, was a transformational figure. He really was, and in more ways than just baseball. From the baseball side alone, he was transformational. He was a catcher. This is a period of time in the late 19th century, late 1800s, when the position of catcher was where you put the worst player on the whole team. Today, it's a very skilled position. Then it was not. It was when the term backstop was coined, which said what the catcher was expected to do was stop the ball in back of the batter from rolling off the field. Don't forget, This was a period when baseball was played often in cleared lots and fields where there was no structured backstop. It wasn't a thing like we understand it today. These fields were sometimes just, especially in the South, having been cleared of rubble from the Civil War just 20 years earlier. So Moses Fleetwood Walker is the first catcher to come along who is an extraordinary athlete. He played all 5 facets of the game. We'd call him a 5-tool player today. You know, he could hit, he could run, he could throw, he could hit with power, and he could field his position. And as you see, he was so good that he was signed by a Major League Baseball team. The Toledo Blue Stockings of the National League signed him to start the 1884 season as their starting catcher. But he was also transformative because of who he was as a person, as a human. He was an African American. And he had been born when slavery still existed. His parents had been born into slavery. And yet, here he was becoming the first Black Major League player as the 1884 season starts. So for many Americans, this struck them as a very uplifting story, right? That 20 years, look at the time, 1884, just almost exactly 20 years from the end of the Civil War, 20 years from emancipation and the freeing of the slaves. A young Black man is about to become the first Black player in the national pastime, the major leagues. Now, unfortunately, not everybody felt that it was an uplifting, feel-good story. And unfortunately, one of those who did not feel that way was a player with a huge influence on Major League Baseball at that time, Cap Anson. Cap Anson was the first bona fide superstar of Major League Baseball, to give him his due. He was a slugging captain of the Chicago Cubs, who were the vaunted, they were the marquee baseball team of the era, and he was their leader, their slugger, their captain. He still holds 2 or 3 batting records for the Chicago Cubs today, which is extraordinary, all of which is his due. Also his due, he was an unrepentant racist. He was a bully, none of which is on his plaque in Cooperstown. And he didn't like the idea that his Chicago Cubs were starting the season against a team that fielded a Black ball player. I put that in air quotes because Cap Anson never used the term Black. He used a different word, which you can imagine. And he didn't like it enough that he decided that his Cubs would play the game under protest against the Blue Stockings, and that going forward, he threatened Major League Baseball that he would no longer play against any team that fielded a Black ball player. So you can imagine that the owners of Major League Baseball at the time had to take this threat pretty seriously. I mean, Anson is the star player of the period. The Cubs are the star team. And so they do. They take it so seriously that in the summer of 1887, in Buffalo, New York, in a vote that has never been made fully public, in other words, we don't know anymore. There's no existent records of who voted how, who these men exactly were. Did anybody vote who was not an owner? We don't know. Nobody ever took a single question from the press. What we do know, though, is that as a result of that meeting in 1887, that it was voted that Black players going forward would no longer be offered a major or minor league contract. Those who were playing under existing contracts, like Walker, would be allowed to play them out, and there would be no more. The color barrier was now a reality. So you might think that this is a period when all Black ball players stop playing baseball. They do not. And I mentioned that a player like Moses Fleetwood Walker, his story goes from merely extraordinary to simply heartbreaking, and it does. I mentioned that Moses Fleetwood Walker was someone who seemed to live to play baseball, and he did. But I don't mean that figuratively. I mean that literally. He played baseball almost every day of the year. He would play baseball in the summer in North America, and then as it began to turn to fall and weather got colder, he began making his way south through Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean. And by the time it was fall and winter up here, he was playing baseball in South America, where it was summer. But now it seemed that he would no longer be able to do what seemed to give his life meaning and purpose. I'm going to read a couple of times during this talk from my book, and I'm reading to you right now when I tell you that he died of a blood disorder in Frankfort, New York in 1913. He was only 55. His unmarked grave told not a word of a truly extraordinary life. For years since the color barrier began to spread in 1887, Fowler, like many of the other early Black professional players, had continued to try and play in the shadow of the descending barrier as teams shed Black ball players and refused to sign more. Fowler had uncommon talent, there's no question. As a matter of fact, he was inducted into baseball's Hall of Fame just this past summer. But often it seemed that his greatest skill was in just seeming to somehow outrun what everyone saw would be the inescapable end. For Bud Fowler, the end came in Michigan in 1895. He was finally out of options. They all were, but Bud Fowler was literally the last Black ball player standing. My skin is against me, Fowler wrote in 1895. If I just hadn't been born quite so Black, I might have caught on as a Spaniard or something of that kind. Now, as the 20th century unfolded, it barred them all. The color barrier was complete. It would take 50 years of fierce Fowler-like will and determination to break through again. So now we're up into the 1890s, right? Color barrier falls in 1887, and this is the period when Jim Crow moves in, and in baseball as well. This is the period of the famous, many would say infamous Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, which starts as a transportation issue in Alabama, trying to seek blacks from being able to ride on trains without there being a separate, dedicated, all Black or colored, as the law put it, car. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court finds for Alabama. This is Plessy versus Ferguson. This is separate but equal. This now goes to all the other states. It affects other businesses as well, the workplace, politics, baseball. And now it doesn't matter whether you're playing baseball or which side of the room you line up on to get a drink of water from a public water fountain. Segregation is now complete, and it is state sanctioned, and it is everything. And baseball that had been an outlier is an outlier no more. So we're not jumping to 1920, but I do want to bracket this period from the 1890s and just around 1900 to 1920. Because I think it points up another part of this story that people often misunderstand, which is that when the color barrier happened, that Blacks were prevented from playing baseball. They were not prevented from playing baseball. They were only prevented from playing Major League Baseball. But this is also a period of incredible Black barnstorming baseball. This is the period of time when about a dozen or so Black barnstorming teams literally crisscross the country, generally in rickety old buses, and they are playing other teams. They're playing white teams. They're sometimes playing Major League teams who have an off day and want to pick up an exhibition game. And they even beat many of these teams, including beating often Major League teams in these barnstorming games. There are attempts at creating a league of Black teams, but there are at least two attempts, but both attempts fail. But some people understand that there will have to be an elite Black organized league for Blacks ever to have any hope of getting Black back to Major League Baseball. And a person who understood that completely was this man, Rube Foster. Rube Foster is rightly called the father of Black baseball because he is the father and creator of the single most significant institution in Black baseball, the Negro Leagues. And he founded them in 1920, but he understood in a way that others did not. He understood that there needed to be an elite level of Black baseball, not for Blacks. Blacks were following these barnstorming teams. They would turn out to support these teams all over the country. He understood that it was whites who would need to see an elite level of Black play to be able to see, envision these players being in the major leagues. And he was able, unlike anybody else had succeeded, he was able to succeed in creating that elite level of Black play, that organized league, the Negro Leagues. And the Negro Leagues are born, in fact, just 123 years ago last week. The Negro Leagues were born in 1920 in Kansas City, Missouri. There is Rube Foster in the front row sitting, proud of his creation. This is the first 16 or so first Negro League teams. I want to draw your attention to this man right here, sitting to the left of Rube Foster. His name is J.L. Wilkinson, and J.L. Wilkinson is the only white owner in the entire history of the Negro Leagues. He is the owner of the iconic Kansas City Monarchs. And I don't bring that up to establish him as some sort of racial peculiarity. I bring it up because there's a direct line. We're obviously talking about breaking the color barrier, and there's a direct line between J.L. Wilkinson sitting right there in 1920 and 25 years out, 1945, and Jackie Robinson being signed to a minor league contract to break the color barrier, because J.L. Wilkinson will be the Negro League owner that gives Jackie Robinson his first professional baseball contract. So the Negro Leagues are born and the Negro Leagues take off, explosive growth. And now people introduce the players, in some ways, it's almost like there had been this hose, right? This fire hose of talent that had been crimped for this 20 years or so during the barnstorming, because there was only about a dozen or so barnstorming teams. But now there are 16 Negro League teams, and that grows to 32 Negro League teams. They're able to separate into a Negro American League, a Negro National League, to have the first of 2 Negro League World Series. And people are introduced to stars like Pops Lloyd, really the first star black home run hitter, and Judy Johnson, one of the most extraordinary black ball players of all time. A decade or so later, Oscar Charleston, one of the greatest fielding ball players of all time, and one of my personal favorites, and who arguably baseball historians now consider the fastest human being to have ever played baseball, Cool Papa Bell. So the first decade of the Negro Leagues in the 1920s takes off, and there was explosive growth. And it looks like the sky might be the limit for the growth of the Negro Leagues. And it might have been if the sky instead hadn't fallen in, because of course the decade of the 1920s ends with the sky falling in on everybody and the Great Depression. I sometimes think that we forget just how cataclysmic the Great Depression really was. We forget, for instance, that a quarter of all Americans were out of work during the Great Depression, and in minority communities, places like Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, flip that. Only a quarter are working in most minority communities. 30,000 plus businesses going out of business every year during the first worst years of the Great Depression, including the Negro Leagues, with one exception, as we'll see, gone, right? So you might wonder how many major league teams survived the Great Depression, because all 16 of the then major league teams were just like those thriving businesses, 30,000 and more of which are going out of business, zero. The reason for that, why it's important to point this up to get a sense of the contrast between the two leagues, the major leagues were insulated from the worst effects of the Great Depression. Why? Because they had fabulously wealthy owners who owned them. Now, the Negro Leagues were also owned by very wealthy, for the Black community, wealthy people who had done well in business, but the problem was they didn't have the kind of deep pockets that the 16 major league owners had. They just did not. The major league teams had advertising from very successful white businesses. The Negro Leagues did not have that. They, in some cases, had slender lines of credit from Black-owned banks. Black-owned banks, gone in the Great Depression. Their advertising came only from businesses in the Black community. So they didn't have the resources that the major leagues had. I mentioned there was one exception, one single exception of the Negro League teams going under, and that was the Kansas City Monarchs. They survived, and they survived because of our friend J.L. Wilkinson, again, the owner, who told his players at the outset of the Depression that he would try to keep everybody on salary. But as he put it to them, the only way we're going to be able to do that is to play baseball pretty much all year long. And they did. Here they are barnstorming through Canada during the early years of the Great Depression. They would not have been able to continue doing that indefinitely. And fortunately for history and for everyone, they didn't have to, because in the early years of the Great Depression, the single most unlikely event in this whole story takes place, the rebirth of the Negro Leagues. As you can imagine, the Great Depression is not a time when things are being reborn. It is a time when things are going to die. And look where they're reborn, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, ground zero for unemployment in America. And look who brings them back to life. Now, you may never have heard of Cumberland Posey Jr. or Gus Greenlee. I'm going to tell you about him briefly, but these are not two people who you would have thought would have collaborated in bringing the Negro Leagues back, primarily because while they were saviors of the Negro Leagues, they were arch enemies their entire lives. Cumberland Posey Jr., fascinating figure in his own right. He was the son of a pioneering Black figure in Pittsburgh at the time. Cumberland Posey Sr. was the first licensed civil engineer, Black civil engineer, started 2 or 3 very successful businesses. And I'm sure he'd hoped that his son, young Cum Posey Jr., would follow him into the business. But Cum Posey Jr. had different ideas. He was a sports nut, basketball, baseball. Baseball wins out because he's approached in the late 1920s about saving a celebrated legendary Black baseball team in Pittsburgh, the Homestead Grays. Homestead is a section of Pittsburgh, and the team is up for sale, and if nobody buys them and saves them, they will go out of business. But Cum Posey Jr. saves the team. He's managed to cobble together some money, and he buys the team. So the Grays are saved, and now he is the owner, he's the manager, he's the general manager, he's the coach, he is in charge of promoting them, pretty much everything, right? But he has a quality that most people weren't aware of before his saving the Grays, and now it comes out. It turns out that he has a skill, remarkable skill, for inspiring young Black ball players. How great was his inspiration for these players? Well, better to just look at the results, right? So the first year that he owned and managed and coached the Homestead Grays, 1931, the Homestead Grays went out and had the greatest single season of any baseball team anywhere in history. Let me put 143 wins in context, okay? So at that time, Major League Baseball played 154 games, not the 162 they play today. They almost went undefeated. And baseball teams don't go undefeated when you play this many games. They simply don't. Let me bring it up to the present day to give you a sense of how extraordinary 143 wins is. There is today, as we are now in spring training in Major League Baseball, right? There are 3 Major League teams today that cumulatively, all together, have not won 143 games in the past 3 seasons. The Grays did that in 1 season. Now, not to be outdone, his archenemy, Gus Greenlee, promptly almost outdid him. So Gus Greenlee, completely different story. Hardscrabble youth, grows up, one of 6 brothers, goes off to fight in World War I. He's wounded at the Battle of Verdun. He's decorated, comes back to Pittsburgh. He needs a job. He cobbles some money together. He buys a rickety old car. He's going to drive a cab by himself, right? One-man cab company. So he's approached at some point about if he wants to make some extra money, how would he like to run some bootleg liquor? Remember, it's prohibition. How would he like to run some bootleg liquor around to some of the speakeasies? So he does that. He's making some more money. Then he's approached about how would he like to run some of the betting around, right? So the bookies were booking bets at that time, you know, for fights, for football games, etc. He said, sure. Then he realizes that if he could just cut out the middleman, he'd be able to keep all this money for himself and make even more money. And he did. And at one point during the early years of the Depression, Gus Greenlee was making $12,000 a week. So you can imagine he didn't even know what to do with all his money. He opens up a jazz club, builds a jazz club, very famous, great story. The Crawford Grill. Crawford Grill on Crawford Street in the Hill District, the Black section of Pittsburgh. The Crawford Grill becomes this remarkable jazz club. Everybody played there. Cab Calloway, Dizzy Gillespie, Ella, Billie Holiday, you name them. They played the Crawford Grill. Now, I don't know how much Gus Greenlee liked jazz. What we know is that he found it a great way to launder some of his dirty money because he was making all kinds of dirty money. And then he's approached, just like his enemy, about saving a baseball team. And the Pittsburgh Crawfords are saved because of Gus Greenlee. So a year after his archenemy wins 143 games, Gus Greenlee's 1932 Pittsburgh Crawfords win almost 100 games. And he does it by doing pretty much the same thing he does and everything else he'd gotten. He stole it. He poached the 2 best players from his archenemy's teams, the Homestead Grays. Now, in fairness, these 2 owners did this with each other their entire lives. They poached each other's best players. But in this case, he had poached not just the 2 best players of the Homestead Grays, they were that. They were also 2 of the best players who ever played baseball. If you look in the back row here, The tall guy standing, promising young pitcher by the name of Satchel Paige. Next to him, a slugging young catcher by the name of Josh Gibson. So it is impossible to overstate the importance, the significance of Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson in helping break the color barrier. They are not unsung heroes. They are very much sung heroes. Satchel Paige, one of the most famous Americans, really one of the greatest baseball players who's ever played. Absolute legend. Both these guys are in the Hall of Fame today. Josh Gibson, a little bit less well known than his friend and sometimes teammate, sometimes roommate Satchel Paige. Gibson was much more quiet, much more reserved, but an extraordinary player in his own right. Slugging catcher, may have hit the longest home run ever hit in Yankee Stadium, also in the Hall of Fame. He was known even in his playing days as the Black Babe Ruth. So that tells you something, right? Funny story. So late in his playing career, Josh Gibson met the real life Babe Ruth. And the story goes that Babe Ruth put his arm around Gibson and he said, "Mr. Gibson, what an honor. Hey, I understand they call you the Black Babe Ruth. How about that?" Josh Gibson apparently said to Babe Ruth, "Well, Mr. Ruth, my people call you the White Josh Gibson. What do you think of that?" So how do we know so much about the Negro Leagues is my next question. We've been going on for the first 15 minutes or so of the talk, which is right. We should be because they're the biggest part of the story. But the Negro Leagues didn't keep records. You can find out all kinds of stats, as I did in reading book after book about the Negro Leagues and researching. You can find everything you want to know about the Negro Leagues, but they didn't keep stats because they were a hand-to-mouth operation that were concerned with just making sure they had enough money cobbled together to buy baseballs, bats, gloves, cleats, uniforms, be able to have a bus to get to a game, the gas they wouldn't have to run the bus. They didn't have statisticians. Now, so you might think, well, the newspapers did. Well, the white mainstream press never covered the Negro Leagues. The only time they covered a Negro League game was when a white major league team was playing a Negro League team. Other than that, they were invisible. They never, in the entire history of the Negro Leagues, devoted a single beat reporter to covering either one Negro League team or the entire Negro Leagues themselves, not once. So if the Negro Leagues weren't keeping track of themselves and the white mainstream press wasn't keeping track of the Negro Leagues, who was? The second most vital, significant, unsung hero in the entire story, the Black press. The Black press kept track of the Negro Leagues. And the Black press, this is the golden age of the Black press in America. Very few of these papers still exist, and if they do, they're mostly online. But this was the golden age of the Black press in America. Pioneering publishers like Robert Lee Vann of the Pittsburgh Courier, greatest distribution of any Black newspaper in American history, just slightly more so than Robert Sengstack Abbott's equally legendary Chicago Defender. And they hired legendary sports writers like Wendell Smith and Sam Lacey, who were charged by these pioneering publishers to be part of the story. And this is important because we think of journalists today, I can say this as one myself, where, you know, the whole point is that we pretty much most of the time want not to be part of the story. And we want to make sure that we are being as objective and impartial as we possibly can. Well, these guys were, for the most part, with one exception. When they covered a game, those publishers gave them an important order, which was that they were to remind people why you couldn't see players like Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson in your major league city. In other words, when Wendell Smith covered a very, very famous game in 1939 at Yankee Stadium between the New York Yankees and the Black Yankees, led by Satchel Paige, who won and who struck out Joe DiMaggio 3 times in that game, only time the great DiMaggio ever struck out 3 times. So Wendell Smith, when he wrote up that story, didn't just give the box score and the stats of the game. He reminded people who were absolute, you can imagine, Yankees fans, people everywhere, when they were reading this story all over the country about who is this pitcher, Satchel Paige, struck out DiMaggio 3 times. Why can't we get him? That's what Wendell Smith reminded people. Why you couldn't have Satchel Paige pitch for your major league team. Because there's still a thing called the color barrier. That's what they did. So you might ask, well, wait a second. If these Black newspapers which, by the way, were just like the Negro League teams, hand-to-mouth operations, cobbling together money to meet deadline 5 nights a week and getting the paper out to the half a dozen or so little news boxes in just the Black community. How were they reaching people all over the country? Which they were. People all over the country were able to read about that game at Yankee Stadium. Think about that. In a Negro League newspaper, in a Black newspaper, in Miami, Bangor, Boston, Phoenix, Fort Worth, San Francisco, LA. How were they able to do that? The single most improbable ally in this entire story, and the one that I have always found most fascinating, the Pullman Porters. Now, you know the Pullman Porters? The Pullman Porters were the face of overnight train travel, the public face of overnight train travel in the golden age of rails, 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. These were servants on wheels. That's not my description. That's the mission statement of the person who created the Pullman Porters, George Mortimer Pullman, who described them as being servants on wheels. They would greet passengers, mostly white, at the platform. They would show you to your seats. They would show you to your table, and later show you to your berth. So what did they possibly have to do with baseball? Back to those pioneering newspaper publishers. They were very, very creative businessmen, and they understood that in newspapers, it is all about growing your distribution. And they had no way of growing their distribution beyond the cities in which they were, like the white mainstream papers did, without some help. And they found that in the Pullman Porters, who they recruited, not every Pullman Porter, but they recruited many Pullman Porters to help distribute these Black papers all over the country. Now, mind you, this wasn't part of the job description, and any one of these porters who was caught distributing Black newspapers around the country would have been fired on the spot, but nobody ever was. So how did it work? Like this. Let's say a train is leaving South Station in Boston, and it's going to make a run down the entire eastern seaboard, right? From Boston all the way to Miami. So the Pullman Porters were also responsible for provisioning the trains, right? They worked the kitchen. So let's say that train that's leaving Boston has a deal with a Black bakery in Forest Hills, Mattapan, Roxbury, whatever. And so the little bakery truck pulls up to South Station, and they have in the back of the bakery truck, they have 4 or 5 little 5-foot tall wicker baskets. The baskets are all filled with bread. Underneath the bread are the Black newspapers of Boston, the Boston Guardian, the Boston Reporter, the Boston Chronicle. So the train takes off. Train stops first in, let's say, Penn Station. They offload the Black newspapers from Boston. They unload the Black newspapers from New York. They do the same thing in Baltimore, DC, Chattanooga, all the way to Miami. They're doing this all over the country. So then in 1939, you have Black newspapers arriving regularly, surreptitiously at newsstands all over the country. So now we're up to 1940, which means we are less than 15 minutes away from the end of our talk. Spoiler alert, the color barrier will fall. Jackie Robinson will make a triumphant appearance. And we are only 5 years away from the color barrier falling. So how does that happen? Because I can tell you that Major League Baseball was no closer to dropping the color barrier in 1940 than it had been in 1930 or 1920 or 1910 or 1900. You get the idea. So what changes? What changes? The times change. So the decade of the 1940s ends with another worldwide cataclysm, just like the 1930s ended with the Great Depression. The 1930s end with America edging up to World War. And in New York, this man, Lester Rodney, frames the argument to break the color barrier in a way that nobody had ever framed before. And it is the argument that will bring the color barrier down. Lester Rodney, first of all, is in New York. New York had not been a focus of the struggle to break the color barrier. It had been all about Pittsburgh and Chicago and Washington. Now it turns to New York, largely because of Lester Rodney. Lester Rodney is nobody's profile, nobody's picture of somebody who is an ally in breaking the color barrier. Not because he doesn't want to break the color barrier. He hates the color barrier, but New York hasn't been a focus. He's a sports writer. He's white. He's Jewish. He's a communist. Hey, nobody's perfect, okay? But he gets a job writing for America's Communist Party's newspaper, the Daily Worker, which has just started a sports section. Now, he would have worked for anybody, but he got that job. And so he's now writing about sports, and he also realizes it's an opportunity to tell people about how baseball is going to run into the war, and that the color barrier is a part of this story, because as Lester Rodney began to remind his readers, America is indeed headed for war. Blacks as well as whites, he would remind people, are now training to go fight, and blacks as well as whites will be asked to die if necessary to defend their country. The difference being that those who have just been asked to die for their country, who are black and return to the country, they will still be second-class citizens, still unable to sit where they want on a bus and still unable to play Major League Baseball. This is the argument that will bring the color barrier down in just 5 years. And that argument is picked up by many other people. It's picked up by the black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, which actually offers a rationale for that agonizing question, which many young black men and women suffered through. You know, do I want to go fight? Do I want to go fight and die for a country that doesn't value me as a first-class citizen? The Double Victory campaign, which was based on Lester Rodney's argument and sponsored by the Pittsburgh Courier, was meant to answer that agonizing question. This handkerchief was given out in the newspapers, and it framed the argument like, yes, double victory. Yes, go fight. Double victory. First, go defeat Adolf Hitler. Second, come home, defeat Jim Crow. And that handkerchief was worn in the bomber jacket sleeve of all of the Tuskegee Airmen, the most celebrated all-black unit in World War II. But it is another, far less known all-black unit in World War II that will take us to the end of the story, the 761st All-Black Armored Unit. The 761st was the first all-black armored unit in World War II in the country's history. It was led by a young lieutenant by the name of Jack Roosevelt Robinson. And you see him under the turret of the tank there, and he is got his lieutenant stripes at Fort Kearny in Kansas in 1941. And then he is transferred to Fort Hood in 1942 to help take control of the 761st. 761st, as I said, first all-black armored unit in the country's history. They set records for consecutive days at the front. They are one of the first units to cross over into Germany and one of the first units to liberate a death camp. So they are famous, also will become famous because they are led by Jackie Robinson as a young lieutenant. And he cannot wait to get to Europe and fight the Nazis from the turret of a Sherman tank. Doesn't get there. 761st does without Jackie Robinson. Just before the 761st disembarks, Jackie Robinson flunks his final physical. He had been an All-American halfback at UCLA. Injury flares up, not cleared for combat. He's crushed. The 761st ships out. Jackie Robinson decides he's going to go back to the base. He's going to get a drink at the Black Officers Club. He jumps on a bus. Huge base, Fort Hood. Buses constantly circling the base. He jumps on a bus, takes a seat right behind the driver in the front row. You can imagine where this might be headed. At this time, blacks on buses were expected to move to the back of the bus as buses filled up with white passengers like this bus did. And Jackie Robinson refused to move to the back of the bus. Now, he knew something that the driver probably did not know. He testified later that he did not know. Jackie Robinson knew that 48 hours earlier, President Roosevelt had signed an executive order prohibiting segregation on transportation within domestic American military bases. So Robinson knew he could not sit where he wanted. Driver didn't know or didn't care. Either way, Robinson refuses to move. The bus driver pulls over in front of a sentry post. Two MPs, armed MPs, get on the bus. They handcuff Jackie Robinson, take him off the bus. He's arrested, court-martialed, insubordination. I wonder how many of you know that Jackie Robinson was once court-martialed. Well, don't be ashamed, because most people don't know that. In fact, I always say, and it sounds like a twisted piece of logic, but I think you get my meaning. If Jackie Robinson had been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged, you would never have heard of Jackie Robinson. But he beat the court-martial. And now he was honorably discharged from the Army. He's about to trade his Army uniform for a baseball uniform because he needs a job. And somebody suggests to Robinson that the owner of the Kansas City Monarchs, J.O. Wilkinson, needs players, that apparently some of his best players are not yet back from Europe. And so Robinson writes him a letter and he asks Wilkinson if he could have a tryout and try out for the Kansas City Monarchs. And Wilkinson writes back and he says, no, you can't have a tryout. I know who you are, Jackie Robinson. He says, you can't have a tryout because you have a job. I'm giving you a job. So get yourself to Houston and spring training for the Monarchs. We open up in Kansas City in early April, and Jackie Robinson headed directly for Houston to begin spring training with the Monarchs. And now we are less than 6 months from the end of the color barrier, and the final battle of the color barrier is about to be fought in Boston. And I wonder how many of you know that less than 3 weeks from this picture being taken, Jackie Robinson opening up the 1945 season with the Kansas City Monarchs, he will be in Boston on the field at Fenway Park, trying out for the Boston Red Sox. Most people don't know that either because most people don't know Izzy Muchnick. Izzy Muchnick, extraordinary figure in this story, heartbreaking story of his own. Izzy Muchnick was the second Jewish Boston City Councilor. He would go on to become the first Jewish chairman of the Boston School Committee. Izzy Muchnick lived by something that in Hebrew we call tikkun olam, which translates directly from the Hebrew as repair the world. And it is something that Muchnick lived by as a lawyer, as a city councilor. He was constantly looking for ways to make the world a better, more equal, more fair place. And he had been inspired by Lester Rodney's argument about breaking the color barrier. And he was now looking to see if he could pressure some major league teams to offer tryouts for black ball players. He's in Boston, so he's looking at the Red Sox, but he doesn't know how he could possibly establish leverage to force the Red Sox to have a tryout. And then he finds it. He finds it in the guise of the old blue laws that used to exist. And in 1945, there was still a blue law that existed that prohibited Major League Baseball from being played on a Sunday without the unanimous vote of the Boston City Council. Well, Izzy Muchnick had to pinch himself because he realized, I sit on the city council. All I have to do is withhold my vote, and the Red Sox will have to be pressured to do what I'm asking them to do if they want to play baseball on Sunday, which they did. So he wrote a letter to the brain trust of the Boston Red Sox. And there you see Tom Yawkey, you see in uniform there, player manager Joe Cronin, and the tall guy next to him is the general manager, Eddie Collins, himself a Hall of Famer, charming Southern guy. And he gets this letter from their city councilor asking him to have a tryout, not a job, as Izzy Muchnick makes clear, just asking you to consider giving a tryout to some returning players coming back from having just defended America in war. And Eddie Collins writes back and he says, my esteemed Councilor Muchnick, I certainly empathize with your request, but as he wrote, it might interest you to know that in my entire tenure with the Boston Red Sox, not a single black player has ever approached us about a job. I can only conclude that there's no interest. Well, Izzy Muchnick was a bulldog. He was a tough lawyer, and he understood when he was getting the runaround. So he waited a little bit. He waited a little more, and he waited until it was 1 week before the city council was to vote on Sunday baseball in Boston. And then he sent cable, not a letter, a cablegram to Eddie Collins. And he said, Mr. Collins, it appears you have no interest in entertaining my sincere request, and therefore this cable should serve to inform you that when the vote is held on Wednesday next for black baseball in Boston, Major League Baseball, excuse me, in Boston for the coming season, I will be withholding my vote. Well, you can imagine this would have been a financial calamity for the Boston Red Sox. Why? Because in 1945, pre-TV, Major League teams play a doubleheader every single Sunday. The Red Sox would have been denied 50% of their Sunday revenue in 1945. Unthinkable. So they send the cable back to Izzy Muchnick and they say, fine, you can have your tryout. Three players, that's it. 3 players, no press, or the deal's off. Have your players at Gate D, Fenway Park, 11 a.m. Monday morning, April 12th. Well, Izzy Muchnick knew a lot about Boston's bylaws. He did not know a lot about black baseball. So he consulted with Wendell Smith of the Pittsburgh Courier, and he asked him if he could hand select 3 qualified black players to have a tryout with the Boston Red Sox. And Wendell Smith picked the players: Sam Jethro, Marvin Williams, and a promising young infielder out of Kansas City named Jackie Robinson. And they trooped to Boston. They all came to Boston, and they were all ready to try out for the Red Sox on Monday morning, April 12th. But history once again intervened: no tryout. Because on April 12th, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died, and America shut down. 24 hours later, America began to open back up. 48 hours later, America was pretty much back to normal, except at Fenway Park, where the owners, well, clearly they were trying to run out the clock, and they almost made it. They almost made it. All they had to do was get to the afternoon of April 16th, and they were free, because they would have been able to jump on a train, take the train to New York, where they were opening up the 1945 season against the Yankees at Yankee Stadium on the 17th of April. But on the morning of April 16th, the story broke. A white sports writer, Dave Egan of the old Record American, broke the story. And he broke it on the front page as kind of an open letter to Boston sports fans. He said, "You are not aware of it, but at this hour, there are 3 qualified," as he wrote, "Negro players who have been marooned in a hotel room for the last week. And they have been promised a tryout by your Boston Red Sox, who are now trying to renege on their promise and skip town." Well, the Red Sox realized they had to have the tryout. So they called up Muchnick and they said, "Get the players over here." So they did. And they all trooped over to Fenway Park. They took the field, they suited up, they ran the bases, they took some infield, they took some batting practice. About 45 minutes later, they were called off the field. They were thanked very much. They were told that the Red Sox will be in touch. None of them have heard from the Red Sox the rest of their lives. But you know who was paying rapt attention that morning, about 200 miles south of Boston? Branch Rickey. Because Branch Rickey was getting reports that his arch nemesis, he did not like Tom Yawkey, and he was getting reports out of Boston that Yawkey was given a tryout to Jackie Robinson, because he had had a plan already for over a year to sign Jackie Robinson, to break the color barrier, and now he was afraid Yawkey would upset this plan. Look, we know if we could have gone back in time, we could have reassured Branch Rickey that he had nothing to worry about, because it's going to take Tom Yawkey another 14 years to break the color barrier. But he didn't know that. He didn't know that. So as soon as the Negro League season ended in 1945, Jackie Robinson was whisked to Brooklyn, where he signed a minor league contract with the Brooklyn Dodgers' top minor league team, the Montreal Royals. There he is signing the contract. And then, of course, it would be just, 2 years later that he would break into the major leagues. I'll read you from the last page in my book. Wearing number 42, as he strode out to his position at first base amid the din of cheering fans, of broadcasters announcing history, and of exploding flashbulbs capturing it, there were also 2 inaudible sounds at Ebbets Field that day: the sound of a wall falling, and of a cheering that couldn't be heard with the ear, only with the heart. It rose from those not present physically, but spiritually, those who could not be seen, but were there just the same. Moses Fleetwood Walker didn't live to see it, and by the time he died, broken, bitter, alcoholic, he couldn't even imagine it. He was there. Bud Fowler, a man who, as we saw, traveled the hemisphere, just trying to play baseball wherever he could. Now he was in Brooklyn. The Pullman porters, some of them rolling along within a mile of the field that morning on the rails, headed north or south or west. The Pullman porters who had seen to it that the stories about these players like Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson reached readers all over America. They were in Brooklyn. the Negro leaders, past and present, those who had come too early, and those who thought that they too might now walk through the wall. They were there. And the African-American veterans of the war just ended, and those who had given their lives in it, they were there. On this momentous day, a ball game was played before a crowd both present and cheering, and another crowd silent and unseen. They watched a game, and they watched a terrible wrong being finally righted. To be sure, even as a black ball player bounded onto an otherwise all-white field, racism was still alive and well in Brooklyn and clear on across America. So many other barriers remained in place. Sadly, many still are. But on this day, some of the hurt and the humiliation was salved. On this day, hope and faith that had long seemed to have run out seemed to be magically redeemed. On this day, the long arc of the moral universe seemed to bend improbably toward Brooklyn, where it touched down on the grass and the dirt of a familiar old ballpark, where the white lines would no longer bar a black ball player. And as Jackie Robinson came up in the bottom of the seventh inning, right there, and laid down a perfect bunt and raced toward first base, he was not alone. That invisible crowd was suddenly right there, willing him on, running right alongside. And as Robinson sprinted on to second base, slid, and caught his breath, they exhaled with him. After all, it had been a long, uncertain journey, and they had been right there with him. The next Dodger batter doubled. Jackie Robinson rounded third, and he was home. Thank you very much. Thank you. I will invite Courtney back out, and if anybody has a question or two, I'd be happy to take your questions. I'm going to leave this slide up here because if I was there in person, I'd have a table with some books. But if anybody would like to get a copy of the book or a signed copy, all you got to do is shoot me an email at ted@tedreinstein.com, and I'd be happy to do that for you. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ted. This was so cool.
Oh,
what an
welcome.
inspiring story. And I welcome anyone to unmute if they have a question, but I get to start.
Yeah, sure. You do. You get the first question for sure.
So how long have you been working on this book, and what inspired you to write it? I mean, your other books are very New England centric and more, about sites and
Yeah. So I worked on the book. The book came out about a year ago, and I worked on the book for 2 years. And the reason that I wanted to write it was that obviously I'm a longtime baseball fan, and I'm a lifelong hero of Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was a lifelong hero of mine. But as the years went on, and I read more in-depth history about Robinson, I kept seeing these names coming up of people who had helped prepare the way. And it didn't correspond to the rest of, like, when you would see movies like 42, probably the most famous mainstream movie about Robinson. I realized that, and other people would point out too, not just me, that you didn't really see these names come up. People like Wendell Smith and people like Bud Fowler and all these people would come before. I just started to feel like, it really, these people deserve more credit. And that really was what was behind it, was just seeing if, we could shine a little bit more focus. Some people, I don't mean to say that I'm the only person who's ever written about these people. There are some other books that touch on some of these people, but I kind of put them in one place and put them in a chronological timeline, and in that period when the color barrier was created and it stood and then it fell. So that was really what was behind it. Yeah, but thank you for asking that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. We have one comment in the chat. Great talk.
Thank you.
My dad always talked about seeing Satchel Paige often. Was his team located in New York City? Have you heard of Farmers Oval Park?
I have not heard of Farmers Oval.
I wonder if Arnold wants to unmute or elaborate in the chat for us.
I have not heard of that park, but Satchel Paige did play in the major leagues. He's in the Hall of Fame. He was signed by Bill Veeck, who at that time owned the St. Louis Browns, which were in the American League, and they would go on and move to Baltimore and become the Orioles. but he's most famous in the major leagues for pitching for the Cleveland Indians, also owned by Bill Beck, and he pitched in the 1954 World Series. So the fact that your dad got to see Satchel Paige pitch, that is just amazing to me, because Satchel Paige, also a hero of mine, and would be on my list of the 5 greatest pitchers who ever played baseball. So the fact that your dad got to see them, oh, that blows my mind. But I will have to look up that park. I will have to look up that park. But thank you for bringing that up. That's great. That's great. Anyone else?
Yeah, another comment. Thank you so much for sharing this important story, which was fascinating.
You're very welcome.
To this non-fan of baseball, which I will count myself in there as well.
Well, that's all right. No, Courtney, it's totally fine. It's funny too, because when I first started doing outreach and booking talks with this, I would very often, somebody might say, for instance, well, I'm not sure it's right for our group or our library, because we have a lot of people that I think they're not that into baseball. And I always say, what I've come to say is, look, yes, this is a lot about baseball, but it's about so much more. So I always say, if you're interested in civil rights history, don't discount learning about Rosa Parks because you're not interested in buses.
Exactly.
Okay? Because it's a lot bigger. It's a lot bigger.
Yeah.
So, but
and
thank
the book
you.
actually reminds me of there's a book I read about Rosa Parks a long time ago. Basically, her bus boycott was years in the making, decades in the making. All these people came before her, and we only remember her. So it's similar. Yeah.
That's what I mean. It's like, you have these epical events, but it takes people to lay the groundwork. And we were talking about Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks helped pave the way for Martin Luther King. Right. So, everybody stands on the shoulders of people who stood before. So great point. Great point. So I won't press for more questions. I do want to thank all of you folks who came out and joined us tonight. Thank you very much. And Courtney, thank you very much for your help in the Wayland Public Library. Next book, I hope I'll be back there in person on a night that has better weather too. Yes. So, but thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ted. Have a great night.
You too. Thanks, everybody. Be well.
Bye.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Ted, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.